Really kind of scratching my head over in this election cycle is, um, what has Joe Biden actually done in his first term? And I don't mean that in a sarcastic way, but what I do mean is there's been surprisingly little talk. There's a lot of huge programs, a lot of huge bills, a huge amount of spending that passed, especially in 2021 and 2022, funding a huge array of long held priorities for the Democratic Party, for the progressive left, for many people who kind of support that side of the aisle. And now that we're in a campaign, this would be the time to really hammer the drum on how well they've been doing with this. And instead, like, you hear very little. And maybe part of that is, we have Biden's unfortunate inability to articulate some of what he's been doing. But I think it's also a bigger sign of how the party is kind of afraid to highlight their own achievements because of some of what the Republican attacks on inflation and big spending, have kind of maybe worked a little bit and frozen them in place. And I'm not endorsing or not endorsing those attacks, but I'm just kind of telling how I see it as far as how that's going on. So, you had a $1.9 trillion spending bill in 2021. They're not talking about it. It's like something that they barely even did, or once in a while they'll talk about a one little piece of it. But it's been surprisingly small part of the conversation in this election. So what I'm going to do here is kind of go through like what has Joe Biden actually done as president, and try to be as fair as possible so that you can evaluate, is this something that you would want more of or less of, and what is likely to happen in the next 4 years or however long. Unfortunately, he might be around if he were to be reelected, or a similar politician were to take his place. And I'll try not to go too much into those details. There's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of speculation at the moment on who the nominee will be, on whether Biden will dig in or not. But I'm going to break this down into a couple of parts. I'm just going to start out with the domestic agenda that Biden and his team kind of pushed in 2021 and 2022. And then I'm going to move on to some of the big foreign policy issues. So on the domestic side, I think like you really got to think about it in terms of four big pieces of legislation that the Democrats pushed during Biden's first half of his time in office. And those four things would be, almost immediately, they pushed a huge stimulus bill, $1.9 trillion. And just keep in mind for comparison that it was something $750, $800 billion in 2009, when we had a much worse economic situation to deal with. And many people did criticize it as being too small, and for many years I believed that it had been too small. But I'm willing to revise my opinion a little bit based on what I've seen the last couple of years. But that was what was guiding the thought process, was that we really need to do it big this time. So they did $1.9 trillion. We're going to go into where all that money went. But that was just the beginning. There was a second bill in 2021 covering, his infrastructure plan, which has typically been one of the most popular forms of spending that, a broad variety of political viewpoints and American voters, have claimed that they want to see. And Biden and his team passed, with help of Congress, several $100 billion of additional infrastructure spending. It's very weird to me that you rarely hear about that. You think that would be something that they'd want to push. So we're going to go into what kind of infrastructure spending there was, and how that's affected things, and how that might continue to affect things over the coming years. Then there's a couple relatively smaller bills, but still huge bills compared to what's been passed by any previous Democrat for the last 40 years, at least back to before Jimmy Carter. The CHIPS and Science Act, which was kind of a big bill, a few $100 billion, about $300 billion or so for science funding, for research into superconductors and modern computing advances. Definitely with an eye on helping the economy, but also helping the U.S. compete with foreign adversaries such as China and other countries, maybe Russia, and so on, over the next couple of decades. So that one's a little bit of a hybrid between domestic and foreign policy, but we'll go into what is in that. And then finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was another almost $1 trillion, passed to supposedly address inflation, although the name of that was kind of a political creature. They basically took a bill that had other priorities and slapped the name Inflation Reduction on it because it was 2022, and inflation was almost at its peak at the point in time at which this bill was passed. Nevertheless, there's a lot in there, especially dealing with modernizing and moving into green energy, whether you support that or oppose that. We'll go into what's there. And then my goal in all this is, I think lost in a lot of these discussions is what have the Democrats actually done? Is that something that I agree with and that you would agree with or disagree with? I think in the short answer, without giving up too much here, is I think if you support an active federal government, if you support aggressive stimulus of the economy, if you support aggressive government investment into domestic infrastructure and scientific research and social welfare spending and all of that, then this administration's probably done more in that area than Obama or Bill Clinton, certainly Jimmy Carter, maybe going back to LBJ. You can make a slight argument for the Affordable Care Act just because it's a longer-term program, and a lot of these were one-shot big spending packages. But he's definitely been a very active president on spending and economics, and there's kind of a strange reluctance to tout that and lean into it, especially on some of the more popular aspects of these programs. And conversely, if that's not what you want to see the government do, then this guy's obviously not your man. If you see this as wasteful spending, boondoggles, enabling lower levels of government, because a lot of these funds are just transferred to state and local governments and various departments of the federal government to kind of grease the wheels and help their operations out, then you're probably philosophically not in line with Biden. So yeah, that said, I run into these comments sometimes from left-leaning people mostly. They're like, Biden's done so much and he's accomplished so much, but people don't realize it. And, I find those comments a little hand-wavy, and I don't think anybody's really just, kind of laid it out. I want to try to lay it out here. So, starting with domestic policy, we're going to jump into the American Rescue Act of 2021. You can obviously follow along with these links. And just for background, this was kind of like the very first thing that the Biden administration jumped into early in 2021. A big bill, $1.9 trillion economic stimulus, kind of with the philosophical assumption that the economy was in very bad shape after the COVID pandemic shutdowns, which supported at first by everyone, but probably more associated with the left end of the political spectrum, and that more needed to be done than the Trump administration had done with their own different large stimulus bill in 2020 to really pull the economy out of the slump of the shutdown, and to not repeat the mistakes of 2009, 2010 that a lot of people on the political left had seen the Obama administration was making, with kind of being overly cautious with their own rescue plan. They wanted to blow this one out. And as you can see in the legislative history here, this wasn't like a very bipartisan bill at all. I think the Democrats had 220 seats or so. It says right here, the final amended bill passed 220 to 211, with one Democrat voting against it alongside all Republicans. So this was a straight party line bill, basically. And here's what was in that bill. Here is the spending. So when people are talking about all the stuff that Biden has done, and whether you're on the right and you're trying to cut him down, or I've seen some people kind of more on the progressive left being like, he didn't do anything, like, who the heck does he think he is? Let's look through here. And unfortunately, this isn't organized by amounts. So we're going to start with the largest piece of the pie here is direct payments, $430 billion. And this is kind of like the check that you got in the mail, if you made a certain amount of money or less. Direct payments, simple as that. Pump money into the economy to help people float themselves through. And this kind of like drove up the savings rate a lot in 2020, 2021 with the other stimulus from the Trump administration, along with people just saving money because they were spending a lot more time at home, not going out very much, not going on vacations. A lot of savings built up, and that's one of the things that would eventually, according to many people, overheat the economy in 2021, 2022. So nothing too complicated here. The next biggest chunk, state and local aid. So what does this mean? Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund, Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. This basically gave billions of dollars to the state government of almost every state in the country, to make up for revenue shortfalls by the states. Somewhat prorated based on the size of the state. So I unfortunately can't find the numbers. I saw some numbers a while ago. But for example, Florida got about $9 billion from the federal government. Texas got about $15 billion from the federal government. And just to try to put that in perspective, if I'm able to really quickly, what is the annual size of the Texas budget? $15 billion, even to a state as large as Texas, is, like a little bit of a shot in the arm. Less than 10% of their annual spending, so let's not go crazy, but, I don't think anybody would hate having that kind of money, even though every Republican congressman voted against this bill. There's cases of governors putting that to use for higher teacher salaries, whether directly or indirectly. But the Democrats have not really, I think, done much to take the credit for things like that. A lot of money to extend unemployment, a lot of money to schools to, help them reopen, supposedly. So $172 billion, but, probably, a lot of that is like, let's help them reopen by lowering class sizes, which of course requires more space, more teachers, things like that. So as you can see, tens of billions for school districts, for universities, and so on. Kind of just to keep the lights on, and probably to help fund. There's money sloshing around. Same with healthcare, $160 billion. A lot of that's, your COVID tests were free. They certainly aren't free to produce or to make. If you were poor, then you got some child care subsidies and so on. And then, some priorities, substance abuse and mental health. That's always been a priority that some people want. $3.6 billion. There was a time when that was a lot of money just to put into a bill all by itself, not too long ago. And now it's just kind of an asterisk in this larger thing. You hear people say, like, we need money for mental health. We don't spend enough. And, I guess compared to the problems we have, $3.6 billion is probably not enough, but it's certainly not nothing. So how much would be enough? 30 billion, 90 billion? But all these would make easy talking points. We're the party that we dedicated billions of dollars to help America's mental health crisis. Easy talking point. And I just hear it being made strangely not that often. I won't go into the other kind of smaller line items. $50 billion for FEMA. I think they needed money anyway. Some of these are kind of just putting money in the back door to help, because FEMA is definitely throwing a lot of money out the door, subsidizing people living in very risky areas over the years, and they chronically had some financial issues. It's kind of same with like Amtrak. $18 billion for airlines. You could call that a bailout if you wanted to, but you could also say, I'm Joe Biden, I'm supporting the airlines. And I'll say it again, my larger point is you just don't hear these kinds of arguments, and I doubt very many people know how much money was spent and who all it went to. So that was kind of like the first thing. And then a lot of 2021 was spent with negotiations over infrastructure investment. And you can see this passed, it was still mostly a party line vote in the House, but in the Senate you had quite a few Republicans supporting this legislation. $1.2 trillion in total, but about $550 billion is money that would not have been spent otherwise. So let's go into what we have here. Not the best chart here. These numbers are billions. So I know a lot of people, when they think about infrastructure, they're like, oh, roads, bridges, that was about 20%, exactly 20% of this bill. Utilities, passenger and freight rail, over 10%. Broadband. So, a lot of people in rural areas traditionally had horrible internet. That's just one example. Biden could say, we're invested billions of dollars in getting internet to every American, urban, rural, whatever. You could turn that into a talking point easily. We've invested billions of dollars to fix the Flint water crisis. $55 billion to basically, ensure clean water quality for the United States, even though a very small percentage of the U.S. had poor drinking water in the first place. And in my opinion, the Flint thing required colossal mismanagement of their water by multiple levels of government, including local, state, and a little bit federal. Western Water Storage, this was a gimme to Kirsten Sinema, basically, to ensure her support, as you can read in the article, and so on and so on. I guess the problem for selling this is it's not sexy to put a road, because there's a road here, a road there, a road in the first place. And it's not like the 1950s where you get to be the one that puts your name on all the roads and you build them from scratch and everybody sees them. What people see with this $110 billion is a bunch of orange barrels and traffic jams and a longer time getting to work. And the benefits of this accrue, over the next 10, 15, or 20 years, long after Biden, Trump, and anybody else running for president today is out of the scene. So that's kind of an unfortunate reality. However, there is a good way to make the case that we are putting a lot of investments into roads and clean energy. I've heard surprisingly little of that. And I've heard a lot of people poo-pooing, like, what did Biden do? These are all programs here. Passenger and freight rail, $66 billion is not chump change. That's larger than the latest Ukraine aid package, for instance. You hear people say, like, $60 billion for Ukraine, but what are we doing here at home? And this is just an asterisk in a larger spending bill, which is one of the four the Democrats did. They're not getting out in front and refuting those attacks. $65 billion for broadband development. $73 billion for clean energy transmission and to overhaul the nation's power infrastructure. Now, obviously, if you're a Republican, you're probably going to hate this, but if you're a Democrat, I think it's something that you need to be talking about quite a bit, especially because you have a lot of flack from the left that you're not doing enough on the environment and to fight global warming. And as we'll see as we continue to move through these, I think that's kind of an unfair attack. Whether you like or dislike green energy, the Biden administration has done a lot to facilitate that. course, Biden got a little unlucky that there was a bridge collapse in Baltimore. But this is the kind of thing that we've put tens of billions of dollars into making less likely and trying to prevent. It's a lot of money. I'm not going to harp on this for too much. We'll move on to the CHIPS and Science Act. This is another big one. We're moving into 2022 now. This one was significantly more bipartisan. $280 billion to boost domestic research and manufacturing semiconductors in the United States. Subsidies for chip manufacturing, investment tax credits. This is basically scientific research and industrial policy. And kind of significantly different from anything we saw under Obama or Bill Clinton. He'd never in 6 billion years seen this under George Bush or other previous presidents. So this is definitely a big change that you hear very little about in the campaigning. Again, surprisingly to me, I think it's political malpractice not to be talking about this more. $174 billion to the overall ecosystem of public sector research and science and technology. So human spaceflight, quantum computing, material science, biotechnology, experimental physics, and so on. Of course, there's a DEI and workplace development kind of component into all of these, because that's the reality of passing anything with who we got right now. Another one where you see the House is pretty much party lines. No Republican's going to jump the boat on this, but the Senate, a little bit broader vote in the House. A few Republicans did jump over to support the Senate version. I always just go straight to the background and provisions, and unfortunately this one doesn't have as neat of a diagram as some of the other articles do, but the biggest chunk, this is like 2/3 of the bill right here in this paragraph, so very poor formatting, but a lot of things around energy storage, hydrogen, carbon capture, a lot of stuff around green energy. And this is just one of the bills that does that. And this is something that's going to pay dividends, assuming the money's not just wasted, which is always a big assumption to make when you're putting out that much money at one time. But this is something where you're going to see benefits from this if it pays out over the next 10, 20, 50 years. And it's something that, frankly, it's kind of absurd that this isn't front and center of the Democratic Party platform. We've authorized this. You could easily say, Republicans would never do this, and could they come in and try to cut this funding off or pass another bill that overrides this? Probably not, but at least put Trump on the carpet, ask him straight up, does he support this spending? Because it's a win-win for you. Either he does support you, or he supports 80% of his party and has to take a politically unpopular position. I mean, you always got to be throwing stuff back at your opponent, and I just don't see Biden or the Democratic establishment doing this very well at all. This is just basic, generic scientific research. The CHIPS part kind of comes from semiconductor research, where the U.S. has fallen way behind. Or I don't want to exaggerate, they've fallen behind Taiwan and potentially China, which would be a huge foreign policy handicap. And, the perceived AI Cold War between the U.S. and China. It'd be a big handicap in AI if the U.S. falls behind. So there's a lot of money being pumped into this. I don't know if $100 billion is, does it need to be $1 trillion? Does it need to be $10 billion? I'm not an expert enough to discuss that, but I think it's certainly a huge gap. They're not calling out Republicans for opposing this. They are not calling out Trump, trying to get him on record as opposing this. and they're not even like, I doubt the average person even realizes this was passed. Um, love it or hate it. Finally, the fourth of the big bills, and the last one to be passed, in August of 2022 as well, along with the CHIPS and Science, the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the name here is kind of a joke. I'm not even going to try to pretend it isn't. Overall, $891 billion bill. So this alone is, probably adjusted for inflation, slightly smaller than the 2009 Stimulus Act, but comparable in size. $783 billion go into energy and climate change. I mean, this is a bill that is aimed to kind of overturn the U.S. energy system. It's kind of a bad sign for Democrats if they're afraid to talk about that, because it should be one of their signature issues, done wisely and smartly. But I think they've been intimidated by Republicans on the whole, price of gas issue to, they're just like squeamish to talk about this. Clear party line, Kamala Harris needed to cast the tie-breaking vote on this legislation. So, let's look into what is this $783 billion in energy and climate change that we have passed here as Americans. Also, there's like some tack-ons. This is the bill that actually has that insulin dosage down to $35 debate they had. And that's one of the times in the debate, I think the mainstream media, the left, does overuse the term lie. I know they say you need to fact check Trump that Putin invaded Ukraine because of Biden's weakness in Afghanistan. Well, that's a hypothetical. That's an argument. And, I don't believe that's necessarily a big cause or was a big part of Putin's thought process leading up to that, for example. So I'm not one that says, oh, Trump was right. But I think it's pretty strong to say that it's a lie or a mistruth or whatever. It's an opinion. He's allowed to make that point, and then people will decide based on what they see of Biden whether it's true or not. That's my thought on that. And I think there are enough actual lies that when the media overuses the term misinformation on petty issues like that, they don't actually convince people. They just kind of lower their own credibility so that when an actual huge lie comes, the media is people are less likely to look at a New York Times fact check on this huge issue over here, like, maybe the 2020 election, because there's these three Mickey Mouse issues that they kind of like overuse the term misinformation on. And I think the Ukraine thing is a bit of an example of that. Went on a little bit of a tangent. What started that was, this is the bill that lowered the price of insulin. It was passed in 2022. Not a single Republican voted for it. Kamala Harris was the tie-breaking vote. And this is, Biden can take the credit, and for Trump to imply that he had anything to do with this is a joke. And part of Biden doing a very poor debate was just not being able to call Trump out on anything like that. And I think Trump realized it, and it made him more likely to say anything that came to mind. All right. With that out of the way, let's get into the $783 billion, which is actually the largest part of this. Addressing domestic energy security and climate change, including funding for drought resiliency in western states. And you got a laundry list here. So this is where some of that stuff, like, oh, they're spending $10 billion on EVs, yada, yada, yada. But there's a lot of stuff here. It's one of those things. It's 10 billion here, 20 billion there. But if this is what Democrats believe in, they need to be saying, we put $30 billion to develop nuclear power in the United States. Like, that's a talking point to facilitate energy independence from Russia and enable us to compete with China and other countries with a green neutral source of energy. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that they can say on that. I haven't heard any of it. And not because they're making better talking points, but because they're just muddled. They've decided that democracy and abortion are the main talking points. I think that's a mistake. This is something that Biden did. Tens of billions of dollars and basically getting us to move towards green energy and electric vehicles. More manufacturing and so on. This article's surprisingly vague for that amount of money, what's actually going to. But I think you get the idea, and certainly something that you can research further on your own time. Now, of course, people from the conservative persuasion, they see $800 billion getting pumped into new technology investments like this, which is a big deal. A lot of them are just going to see a boondoggle. They're going to see an attack on the oil industry and so on. And if you think that this is not something that we should be, for lack of a better term, hitting the gas so hard on, moving to green energy, then you're probably not going to like this bill very much. And it's a big part of the federal spending. Now, we talked about 4 bills which add up in aggregate to well over $3 trillion of additional spending. Let's put this into context. How successful was my visit? The size of the U.S. economy, I should have that ready to go, but it's about $25-30 trillion. Where it's actually such an important number, I'm going to pull it up. $27 trillion. So, the size of your government spending is, $4 or $5 trillion a year. The point is that when you're adding $3 trillion of discretionary spending on top of that, that's a huge amount that's going to have impacts that ripple through the economy. Typically you're $6 trillion, about $1 trillion of that for the military. I don't know, $2-3 trillion for just programs like Social Security and Medicare. 1.7 trillion deficit in 2023. So this isn't small potatoes we're talking about, and I think it's hard for your average person that doesn't deal with numbers very well, hates numbers, to really appreciate what a huge amount of money that Biden has spent. I think the way to sell this is they do it a little bit with insulin, and I'll give them credit for that. But they got to find little things here and there, like we tax stock buybacks. I mean, who cares if this is a little bit of a Mickey Mouse amount or tax on those stock buybacks? You think if Trump was a Democrat, he'd stop himself, or would he be saying, "We are attacking stock buybacks. We're putting a stop"? He would say, "I stopped stock buybacks." He would be out in front on this. I mean, this is a very popular issue. I don't think more than 10 or 20% of Americans would disagree with this policy. I mean, so you got to sell this. A lot of things like that. You got to say, like, we're taxing corporations to help the poor. I mean, what's the actual amount you're doing here? Modest, but could be a lot more modest. Push the insulin. I mean, push the funding for green energy and focus on the parts of it that are popular. Scientific research, space travel, semiconductors. There's a lot to go on here that you could really run on if you're a nimble campaigner and debater. They're just not getting the message out. Okay, I clicked here a little too soon. But I think the second part of this that's important to talk about is foreign policy. And, I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to foreign policy. Obviously, there's kind of just like a general attitude that the United States takes. Biden's much more kind of uh, an Atlanticist, you might say, someone who's going to be close with Europe and try to facilitate really good relations with countries like Germany and France and the United Kingdom, um, and the EU in general is a huge priority for the United States with Canada, um, versus Trump, who's a lot more transactional. Although there are some countries out there, arguably Israel, India, maybe Mexico, and a few others who had a little bit better of a relationship with Trump. Although Trump said some wild things about sending commandos to Mexico that will probably have damaged that relationship quite a bit. But we'll see. So that's a general attitude. But the four specific things I'm going to go into are, what's Biden done with this war in Afghanistan that he was dealt, um, the situation in Ukraine, and then the situation with Israel. Also worth noting that he's kind of continued the pretty antagonistic attitude towards China that Trump really brought in. That's not the kind of attitude that um, Obama had it a little bit towards the end, but not nearly as much as Trump and Biden. There were a lot of scare tactics that Trump was being too tough on China. If you'll remember the media, um, outside of like Fox News, the left mainstream media in 2017, 2018 was really going hard after Trump for um, his China policies. And Biden has changed those slightly, but it's fundamentally the same approach to China. Certainly, like compared to George Bush, who was, just trying to open things up to China as fast as possible. A huge change. And I think it's also worth talking about, Biden has greatly cut back, reduced the level of drone strikes that the U.S. is doing in the Middle East compared to Trump or Obama. That could be an easy win for him. Or, maybe you wouldn't want to say that in a nationally televised debate, but you should be telling kind of progressive activists about that policy a lot more than I believe he is. Although they are a tough group to please. I'm not trying to pick on the far left, but if you're a far right, far left, if you're outside of power and you're a pressure group, it's never in your interest to be satisfied. Because it's kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease. So the person in power, they're never doing enough. They need to do more. Yada yada yada. The problem is when you eat your own applesauce a little bit too strongly on that, you kind of create a toxic, corrosive atmosphere between yourself and that party in power, who, as we've seen with domestic policies, really kind of bent over quite a bit to work with the progressive left of the United States on spending. Many would argue to their peril. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. I also want to note I didn't talk much about immigration on domestic policy, and some would attack that as a mistake. I think on there it's not that that Biden really passed anything. Obviously, I think it's more what didn't he do. A lot of criticism that he didn't use the power that he had to keep more refugees out of the United States, or to at least enable border patrol in other states to do that. We've seen how many billions of dollars going around to all these places. Not a lot going to border control because the Democrats and Republicans can't agree on the right process to do that. Democrats want to tie it to a path to citizenship, and a lot of Republicans just refuse, and that's kind of a sticking point where until somebody budges there, the funding for border control, probably went up a little bit, but You can see all these huge bills that were passed. None of those had anything to do with border control. So he's getting attacked a lot for really not doing much by a lot of people on the right. Although it's worth noting his approval rate's about 20% on the immigration issue, so it's not just folks on the right. So maybe I could have talked about that a little more, but I think relative inaction is probably a fair way to put it. And another thing that he did there, that was another thing that he did, because of pressure from the progressive left and kind of that ideology, influencing his administration in a way that was probably politically harmful. So, I think the progressive left needs to understand that Biden's really taken a lot of flack and political damage to support some of their policy priorities. But it's kind of a way of leading into Israel, because that's consuming more oxygen than any of these people, and it's not really very cool in that political wing to say, oh, but Biden did this, and that. It's all about, I see genocide Joe signs among the radicals. So we'll get into that. The first thing on the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, this was something that, to be fair, was negotiated by Donald Trump. Agreed to a deal, and the drop dead date was initially May 1st, 2021, based on a deal that Trump signed with the Taliban in Qatar in 2020. Now, I think everybody knows that this kind of turned into a mess. But, what was going to happen to this government? What if the U.S. was still there today? How much longer would it take before this kind of government that's being propped up, because they're obviously not wanted by the people who call the shots in Afghanistan, how long would it have lasted? Would the U.S. need to be there another 20 years? Like, you got to pull out eventually if you're not prepared to stay there. And it's kind of lost its strategic priority with bin Laden being dead and the world moving on to other foreign policy challenges. So, it's hard to argue with the plan to get out of there. It was just a little, people say the execution was bad, but you phase out, how could the execution have been better? Maybe you don't do it so fast. Maybe you're just realistic. Maybe you keep behind, 1,000, 2,000 soldiers just to guard Kabul and save face, but you're not going out in the rest of the country. I don't know how that would work. It's a tough challenge, but Biden did kind of decide to continue with the original plan, which was pending, the Taliban doing certain activities. The initial date was May 1st, and that's when the Taliban began their final offensive. They kind of you could say, waited out the clock. But in any case, this was a big L for Biden and a big L for kind of the American image. Maybe it did lead to Ukraine, although I think there were lots of other factors there. But that happened, obviously in August of 2021 was when that situation came to a head. If you look at Biden's approval rating, took a huge hit throughout that. And I think it was something that a lot of people saw this on the news that maybe didn't see, a road in southern Michigan being repaired because it had too many potholes. You don't see that on the news. So that's just kind of bad optics for Biden. With Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, or invaded the rest of Ukraine outside of Donbass and Crimea on February 24th, 2022. There have been a lot of lead up to that, as U.S. intelligence agencies saw over 100,000 Russian troops kind of massing on the border of Ukraine. And, there was debate, is this a bluff? Is this, saber rattling? Not every European ally believed that this was going to lead to an actual invasion, and there was some distrust of U.S. intelligence, maybe rightfully so. because of some of their previous failures. But in this particular case, they were right about it. So there's been a lot of funding to help Ukraine prosecute this war, and I'm not going to get into all the complexities of this very controversial subject, but just very high level, if you believe that the U.S. should be sending a lot of military aid to Ukraine, Biden's clearly the choice that's going to continue that and has initiated that policy. And Trump, very unclear what his policy is. He kind of said a few contradictory things in the debate. One, he said that Putin's peace plan is unacceptable, which is kind of hawkish. Two, he said Ukraine is going to lose the war. Full stop. He didn't qualify that. He said they don't have enough men and they're going to lose the war. And three, that the U.S. shouldn't be sending money or as much money or any money. It wasn't clear to me. Apologies if it was clear in the debate and I'm mischaracterizing. To Ukraine, it should be Europe's responsibility, and that the U.S. is getting way too involved. But it's kind of like, well, if you don't think the peace deal that Russia's proposing is okay and you wouldn't accept it, that means the war would continue. So you either fund Ukraine, or according to your view of the situation, which I actually think is not fully accurate, Ukraine will lose. Now, I think there's a lot more stress on Russia behind the scenes than we might know about, but it's all conjecture, and I don't have access to, the massive amount of classified data I would need to come up with an opinion, and even those that do are just as likely to be correct as incorrect, because it's, you can't predict the world to that level. Anyway, almost immediately, $13 billion of aid. A little bit later on in 2022, another $40 billion in aid. Some of this was humanitarian, a lot of it's military aid. A lot of military aid is drawing down existing U.S. stocks, but if you do it in one place, you can't do it in another place, and it does cost money to create that military equipment or to replace it. And then obviously earlier here in 2024, there was a big package that addressed 3 different theaters at the same time: Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. $95 billion, $60 billion of this for Ukraine. So overall, and there's been some other drawdowns here and there, well over $100 billion towards Ukraine. That's obviously, compared to some of the bills we just looked at, it's not a whole lot, but it's still a lot. It's the kind of money that would have been some serious money for Congress to debate. But the culture around spending money in the government has kind of definitely loosened, even though the deficit's gotten worse, and even though Republicans have in theory dug in a lot more on spending. But ultimately this bill passed fairly handily, in spite of the long delays in getting it up for a vote. And then Israel-Hamas. This is one where Biden's kind of tried to take a middle line between all-out support of Israel that those many conservatives and some national security hawks within the Democratic Party want to see Biden undertake. And obviously there's a pro-Palestine element on the far left and progressive left that is very opposed to any aid, because they believe that, since the start of the operation, more than 30,000 Palestinians, including 20,000 women and children, have been killed, and several thousand more are missing and presumed trapped under rubble. And people look at this, compare it to an attack on October 7th, resulting in the death of 1,100 Israelis, and the word disproportionality does come to mind. So I'm not here to adjudicate this. I think people kind of view both of these countries with if you call Palestine a country, both of these political entities with rose-colored glasses, depending on their political persuasions. But overall, what has Biden done here? He's kind of kept giving military aid to Israel, but criticized them a lot at the same time, and tried to kind of police how they're prosecuting this war. and periodically let his displeasure for Benjamin Netanyahu be known. Um, you could say it's muddled, or you could say it's a reasonable middle ground, depending on how you want to view it. But that's kind of been his policy. So, depending on the issue, the U.S. has been like pretty aggressive in some places. If you count Ukraine, although there's always people that want to be more aggressive in Ukraine and send more actual advisors, troops, airplanes, military equipment, and they say what we've done is a half measure, but done quite a lot here. Um, could say tactically passive in the Afghanistan theater, which kind of led to some very bad optics and PR. And then you got to decide, should we stay longer? Like, how would we have conducted the withdrawal better? Should anybody have been fired? Was it pure incompetence, or was it inevitable based on the overwhelming situation that the U.S. was faced with? So that's kind of my attempt. I'm sure I left some things out. I'm sure people could talk about some other things. I didn't go into who he's appointed. There's antitrust actions from the Justice Department against big tech, but at the same time, most other parts of the Democratic Party are pretty friendly with big tech. Blah, blah, blah. A lot of that going on. In the context of economic performance, the economy kind of whipped back in 2021 from the 2020 COVID downturn. Slower growth since then, but we've had growth. Economic unemployment rate shot very high in 2020. Was already coming down pretty substantially by early 2021 when Biden took office, and kind of continued that trend. His flatline and started to go up. Inflation has been a huge issue. Shot from 1% in 2020 to 7% annually in 2021, 6.5%. And this is kind of Biden getting bailed out a little bit by how you count the years, because like the trailing 12 month from like mid 2021 to mid 2022 actually hit 9.1%. And even now it's been stubborn. Like the Federal Reserve wants this number to be at 2%, and kind of looked like smooth sailing for a while. In early 2023, it was going down pretty fast, but now it hasn't gone below 3, and it's kind of ticked up again. And you have this kind of, like, is higher for longer going to be enough, or did they overshoot and we're about to see a crash, or is it going to be a no landing scenario where inflation goes back up and then there's this whole other mess that has to be dealt with a second time? But these are numbers trailing 12 months of 8%, trailing 12 months of 5% that you didn't really see for a long, long time before Biden's term. Even in 2008, right before the crash, oil prices were through the roof. 5% inflation for a little bit, and then bam, it hit, pretty bad stretch, which nobody wants to repeat. So that's what Biden did. I think he's I consider myself kind of a middle of the road, a normal guy. I think some of these programs were awfully large, bang, 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 probably contributed to high inflation, probably maybe not the best move when you have a long-term budget deficit that's structurally over $1 trillion a year and getting worse. It is technically true that Trump had the worst year ever, but Biden's a close second. You can see the deficit was starting to be under control in the mid-2010s, and it's just gotten worse every year, whether it's Trump or Biden, and really no sign of this turning around, and probably about to get worse with the number of people retiring, the increase in interest rates, and it's a huge challenge for the United States. Something that worries me a lot, but the average voter doesn't seem to be that worried about it. or even if they are worried about it, they would rather cut taxes than seriously try to deal with this, because that's Republican orthodoxy. Democrats not very concerned, happy to spend the kind of money that Biden's been spending. So I think I'll leave it there. TLDR, Biden, his foreign policy's been kind of nuanced. Domestic policy been heavy on spending and on industrial policy. Um, Big stimulus spending. I think that kind of backfired on the Democrats, and it's part of why they're afraid to talk about any of those programs, which is probably a bad sign for their chances in 2024. But either way, highly unlikely that if the Democrats win, whoever ends up running will have unified control of the government to do anything like that in the near future. More likely that Trump will have unified control. I didn't really talk about Trump at all in this because it's really about answering the question, what did Biden do during his first term in office? But obviously Trump would take it in a different direction. So let's end it there. Thank you very much for sticking with this and going through all these charts. And I hope I was able to kind of fill a gap that I just don't see being talked about very much with a lot of these other videos about this election or about Joe Biden.